Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today virtually. And so today I wanted to discuss with you on the physiological mechanisms of dual purpose wheat. Actually, the topic of this presentation came up another day in our department in a conversation between me and Dr. Zarnau and Ian Lofton. And actually, we were discussing things on what happens within the plant when it goes under grazing and why we do things the way we do as far as management for dual purpose wheat. And so today I just wanted to share some ideas with you, some research findings, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have at the end of the presentation or the end of the session. And I'm hoping to hear your comments, your thoughts, and trigger some discussions on this. And so just to give an overview here, brief overview on the dual purpose wheat in Oklahoma, out of that 4.3 million acres of wheat that is planted every year, 50 to 60% of wheat is used for dual purpose wheat. And so many advantages of the systems this system that we all know, it's diversifying the income, spreading the risk, and increasing profitability, and also the quantity and the good quality of forage that we provides for cattle. And so disadvantages that we have seen in our research is that dual purpose wheat usually have a yield reduction of 14% on average as compared to a grain-only production. And half of that is due to the early planting date in the dual purpose wheat, as compared to grain only, and also due to the grazing impact. And I'm going to discuss more of this in detail here later on. And so overall, the impact of grazing on wheat, grain yield depends on crop and livestock management and also on the weather conditions following the grazing termination. So when we talk about dual purpose wheat, basically when in looking at the wheat perspective, we are mostly concerned about two factors. So forage production and the recovery from grazing. And so if we were to rank the needs of fall forage production, would go with moisture, light, nutrients, and variety. So very important factors that will influence the amount of forage that we will produce to feed the cattle. And there is a direct and straight correlation between above ground biomass and water that is used by the crop. So here what you're seeing is the water productivity graph. So it's biomass yield response to water. So there is this direct correlation and strong correlation. So the greater the amount of water used, the greater the biomass that is produced. And so when we look at the radiation use efficiency, so that means the biomass that is produced per unit of light intercepted, we also see that strong and direct correlation with the greater the amount of light that is intercepted by the crop, the greater is the amount of biomass that is produced. And so management practices that we do that will increase the amount of water, the amount of light that is intercepted by the crop, the greater will be the amount of biomass that is produced. And so when we look at the solar energy, total radiation by month in Ardmore, Oklahoma, we see here in September how it is much higher, and then values starts to decrease as we go into December. And then it starts to increase again by March. And so this is one of the reasons why when we plant in Oklahoma for dual purpose wheat to maximize forage production. And so we plant here in September, sometimes late August. So we are trying to maximize the use of that total radiation that is available to produce forage. And so when we think about why when we plant in the dual purpose wheat, so planting earlier will maximize the amount of cumulative light that is intercepted by the crop and will result in more early season forage. And so in this graph, you see here yield being that forage yield in this bottom line and grain yield in this upper line here, and then day of the year. And so planting earlier by late August, you see here the great amount of forage. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that is the maximum cumulative light that is intercepted, and how that forage production starts to decrease as we delay planting. And for grain yield, here we see that actually planting too early will hurt grain yield because of the excessive top growth and possible excessive use of water early in the season and too much biomass that will crops may run out of water later on. And so so here basically the optimal window for dual purpose wheat, it's in between September 10th and 20th, which is the time that we have that trade-off between maximum forage production while also minimizing grain yield losses due to the early planting. In planting here in this time of the year, we have seen that it provides a good forage growth. We have enough canopy establishment, usually depending on the weather, but usually we do. And also it does provide enough time for the roots to develop and anchor the plants before grazing starts. And when we also look at seeding rate, increasing seeding rate results in more forage, as we see here, and that is basically because we have a quicker canopy closure, and so a more light that is intercepted by the crop, and so increasing our forage production. And here you can see the same variety in this picture planted on the same date in a higher population and in a lower population. So that's why we see that increase in forage production by increasing seeding rate. And so as a summary, when we look at light in forage production, light has to do with the quantity of light that is intercepted and the management practices that will influence that will be planting date, seeding rate, and also leaf expansion rate. And also we want to know about the efficiency of the light that is converted to produce biomass. So that radiation use efficiency, and that is influenced by variety, by nitrogen fertilization. And so here you can see variety with a poor early canopy closure, and then this is a variety with a good early canopy closure. And so as you can see here, there are differences, and usually what we call these differences is differences in early vigor. Basically, what we are saying is the difference in early canopy closure among varieties that is very important to utilize that light and convert that to produce biomass. And so nitrogen fertilization, very important. It will influence our tiller number, our plant growth early in the season, and also additional nitrogen is usually needed in a dual purpose system to account for that nitrogen removed that is consumed in forage. And so complete canopy closure will maximize our resource use efficiency. So grazing initiation usually is 45 to 60 days after planting, depending on the environmental conditions. 6 to 8 inches of top growth is required. And we also need that secondary root well developed to be able to anchor the plants and allow grazing without pulling the plants out of the ground. And as we go into that grazing initiation period, a canopy cover of about 50% is usually recommended for that period. And so overall, impact of grazing on wheat yield. So like I said before, about 14, there is on average a 14% yield reduction from grain only to dual purpose. In half of that, it's due to that early planting date. We have an increased risks of pests and also the excessive top growth and the possible use of too much energy ahead of the game. And so half of that, it's due to grazing impact, which includes grazing intensity, time of termination, and possible soil compaction from grazing, from the cattle. And so when we talk about the dual purpose system, like I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, it's very important for us to understand the phenology behind it. And so the association between the development of the plant and the formation of yield components. And so that may help us to understand why we manage the way we manage this system. And so basically what you're looking here in this figure is the entire growing cycle of wheat. So from planting to harvest. And here's roughly an estimate of when our grazing period occurs. And so beginning here with planting, that is when we have the leaf initiation, it's our vegetative phase. And it's also where we define our stand. So our plants per square meter. And as you can see here in this bottom here are all of our yield components. And you can see that yield components, they're being formed during the entire cycle of wheat. And so consequently, grain yield is also impacted. A lot of things can happen during the growth cycle that will impact yield. And so, however, some phases, they are more important than others as far as affecting our yield components. So just go little by little here. We could stay in this figure all day, but I'm going to briefly highlight some points here to you that I think could be interesting. So this is where our flora initiation starts. So basically where our reproductive stage starts. So you can see here vegetative phase, reproductive phase, and grain filling. And so this is where our reproductive organs begin to form. And as you can see, we have a lot of yield components or our reproductive organs being formed while wheat is under grazing. And so here we have the spikelet initiation. And just to explain here in a second, so spike is our entire head, and the spikelet is within the head where the grain is going to be. And so, for example, here we have the spikelet initiation. So we have our tillering production here, and the yield components, several yield components that are being formed, such as spikelets per spikes, heads per plant or spikes per plant, grain numbers per spikelet, and consequently here our grain numbers per square meter, which is being formed or determined during a very long period of time here in our growing season, and then grain weight later on. And so research has shown that management practices, variety selection that will improve grain number, it's way more important and will impact way more our yield as compared to grain weight. So anything that we can do to improve grain number per square meter is better to improve yields as compared to grain weight. Okay, and so here, like I said, it's our grazing period. So this is the time where we usually roughly terminate our grazing. And you can also see here that any nitrogen deficiency, for example, early in the season will impact our tillering production, especially fertile tillering production. And in any deficiency in nitrogen here at the flora initiation, spikelet initiation will directly affect our yield components, such as spikelets per spike, spikes per plant. And so that's why nitrogen deficiency at early in the season is extremely important to not happen, because that will directly impact our yield components. And so here it's the phase where you see that peak in biomass growth and also in nitrogen demand, and also that's when we would come back here with a top nitrogen application, top stress nitrogen application. And so what happens when we overgraze wheat? Basically, when we use first hollow stem is an indicator of when we should terminate grazing, right? And so we use that not only because of the actual growth stage of the plant, but also because we want to give enough time for the crop to rebuild that canopy that is being removed through grazing. So rebuilds that canopy to pick it up in growth, back again and continue forming our other yield components. And so what happens when we overgraze, we lower that curve, so we have a much lower canopy due to that leaf removal from grazing. And so basically this first hollow stem would be an indicator for us to give enough time for the crop to rebuild the canopy, continue with photosynthesis in developing. Okay, and so like I said, we could be here all day talking on this figure, but I just wanted to highlight a few things here in how there are a lot of yield components that are being formed by first hollow stem. And so, like I mentioned, nitrogen is extremely important for plant growth, for tillering. And you can see here a study that we have. So this is in ZDOX scale, but basically the stages here, it's jointing, anthesis or flowering, soft dough, and maturity. And you can see that additional of nitrogen. So here it's no nitrogen in 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, in how that additional nitrogen application really more than doubled biomass during the growing season, especially later here in the season. So extremely important for plant growth. In grazing intensity, the recommendation is in the fall to have about 250 to 60 pounds of animal per acre, and in the spring could be 1.5 to times greater than the fall. But like I mentioned before, overgrazing can result in several issues, with including winter kill, lower spring forage, and lower grain yield. And so recommendation is going into the winter to have about 50% of that canopy cover and have about 60% of canopy cover late winter at termination. The reason for this is what I mentioned earlier. So then the wheat has enough canopy to continue doing photosynthesis, continue growing, and putting resources to continue producing its yield components or developing the yield components. And so an app, Canopy, can be used to give an estimation of canopy cover and help us to not harm so much yield due to severe grazing intensity. And so there is a research study that was conducted back in 2013 by Bucci and Dr. Edwards in looking at the impact of grazing intensity on recovery and yield. And so basically what they did in this study was to simulate grazing at different heights, mowing the wheat at different heights. So here on the x-axis, we see no simulation, it was not mowed at all, and how the mowing height was reduced from 4.7 to 1.2 inches. The varieties they looked were fuller and overly. Many of you might be familiar with it, and they looked at different parameters during the study. And so what you can see here, that by reducing the mowing height, by intensifying that grazing, we see a reduction in fractional canopy closure, and we also see differences among varieties. And so this here emphasizes the difference among varieties in recovery from grazing. So some may tolerate better than others being grazed really hard. But overall, we see a reduction in canopy closure, in fractional canopy closure, by reducing that mowing height. And when we look at the solar radiation intercepted at a flowering, we also see a reduction of that with reducing mowing height. And so we reduce that light, the amount of light that is intercepted. And when we look at the fertile spikes per square meter, so fertile heads per square meter, we also see a reduction in that by reducing, especially here at this very low mowing height. And the asterisks here mean also a difference among varieties. And so consequently, we see a difference in yield, a reduction in yield, and that is possibly likely due to the reduction in light interception, reduction in fertile spikelets, and how grazing too intensive affected the yield components and consequently yield. And so, like I mentioned before, grazing termination, we usually use first hollow stem stage but that should be used as an indicator of when we should terminate grazing. It is the growth stage that will occur just prior jointing, like I mentioned earlier. It's also when we have 1.5 centimeters of hollow stem below the developing head. And it is important to use this as an indicator because to remove the cattle from the pasture, because it does provide us, allows time for the crop to rebuild the canopy and continue putting resources to the yield components. And so we have seen that grazing past first hollow stem can cause a yield reduction of 1 to 5% per day, depending on the environmental conditions. And so extremely important for us to use this as an indicator, but keeping that in mind that it is an indicator that to terminate grazing, to give the crop enough time to rebuild the canopy from grazing, okay? And so variety selection, in characteristics, so when we go for a dual purpose wheat, there are several traits that we are interested on. One of them is forage yield potential, but I like to emphasize that forage, especially fall forage production, it's not the only factor. Actually, we have seen some cases that some varieties, they will produce a lot of forage in the fall, but they will not be able to sustain grazing. So they will not be able to recover from grazing. And so varieties will differ in the way they utilize resources with that limited canopy to recover from grazing. And so very important trait in a dual purpose system is the grain yield potential after grazing, that is to say, grazing recovery. So resistance to diseases and pests and pest transmitted diseases such as Hessian fly, wheat curl mites, and wheat streak mosaic and barley yellow dwarf. High temperature germination sensitivity, coleoptile length, because usually when we plant earlier, we are planting in warmer temperatures. So very important traits for this system. First hollow stem date, so the later the first hollow stem is, more time we have for grazing. And a low soil pH tolerance, as pH can really affect our forage production. And so a question that I get all the time, it's why varieties differ in recovery from grazing. And so, like I mentioned here in previous slide, because varieties will differ in the way they utilize resources under that limited canopy growth. So some varieties, let's just say here, they will have a larger gas tank in reserves than others, or they will just be able to utilize resources better than others with that after that canopy being removed. And so also the way that varieties will allocate resources. So I believe that the recovery from grazing is associated with the ability of varieties to allocate the resources to more heads, to more grain sites, into more grains per unit area rather than producing larger grains. One of the things that we have seen, it's the growth habit. It seems to be semi-erect, semi-prostrate, one of the growth habits that will maximize that light interception and provide that greater early season forage production, and the ability to conserve energy during early vegetative growth, which does sound very counterintuitive because we want a variety that has a good fall forage production, but also we don't want those varieties that will produce too much early in the season and burn out later on and not be able to recover from grazing. So it's something that our breeding programs need to balance when developing varieties that are able to recover from grazing or varieties adapted to a dual purpose system. So tailoring capacity, very important in time of first hollow stem. So later first hollow stem, but also a rapid initiation. So rapid growth of stem elongation right after cattle is being removed. And so very important traits here that we have seen to benefit our varieties in a dual purpose system. So as a take home, major factors that will affect our forage production: water, light, fertilization, and variety. Planting earlier and increased in seeding rate will provide that quicker canopy closure and more light that will be intercepted, consequently more forage that is produced. So we have multiple yield components or components affecting yield that are determined by first hollow stem. And grazing intensity is as important as grazing termination on the recovery and yield after grazing. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you.